I am Professor Zilthor Goranok, a distinguished xenoanthropologist and head lecturer at the Vorkellen University of Galactic Knowledge, one of the most prestigious institutions of learning in the entire Vecron cluster. My expertise spans thousands of years of recorded history across countless worlds, and I have dedicated my life to unraveling the mysteries of ancient civilizations, mythologies, and extinct species. Today, my lecture hall was filled to capacity with eager young scholars, their eyes glimmering with the thirst for knowledge. My students came from all over the known galaxy. Kevlan scholars with their multi-lobed brains, Ostari researchers who could process auditory input at 3 times the speed of any other species, and even a few Javar nobles whose crystalline neural structures made them living archives of their own planetary history. It was a special day, one I anticipated with great relish. The topic of today's lecture: mythological species. A comprehensive discussion on the races that civilizations had fabricated throughout history, filling their folklore with stories of gods, demons, and impossible creatures that had never truly existed. And at the top of the list, humans. Oh, how I loved this part. The absurdity of the human myth was a subject of great amusement among academia. The sheer stubbornness with which certain fringe historians clung to the idea of their existence had provided ample material for my most scathing critiques. Many students, upon their first exposure to the myths, even found them entertaining. A primitive race of near magical adaptability, capable of surviving the harshest environments, of bending the laws of nature through sheer willpower, of punching creatures 5 times their size and emerging victorious. Laughable. Humans were a convenient fabrication, a relic of civilizations that had once needed explanations for historical gaps and anomalies. Their so-called achievements existed only in half-decayed records, unverifiable and inconsistent. Every so-called sighting, every claim of a hidden Terran colony had been debunked as mere wishful thinking or outright fraud. And so, with confidence in my heart and certainty in my voice, I stepped onto the podium and tapped the control panel, dimming the lights. A large projection filled the auditorium, displaying a classic artist's rendition of the human figure. Bipedal, symmetrical, soft-skinned, their small eyes almost mocking in their simplicity. I took a moment to savor the silence before beginning. The topic of today's lecture, I announced, is one of the most persistent myths in galactic history, the legend of humans. I paused, watching the subtle reactions in the audience. Some students smirked, others rolled their eyes. They had heard the rumors, of course. Some had likely seen conspiracy forums that claimed humans had once been real. But they were here, in my lecture, to learn the truth, that such ideas were the domain of fools. And then the door opened. 3 figures stepped inside. Every cell in my body froze, because I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was looking at humans. I stood there utterly paralyzed, my mandibles locked together so tightly that I could hear the faint creak of my exoskeletal plates shifting. My 2 hearts pounded in an erratic rhythm, struggling to process the impossibility before me. The 3 figures moved with a casual confidence that set my nerves ablaze. They stepped further into the room, their bizarrely smooth faces wearing expressions I struggled to interpret. The tallest one, a male, had a slight upward curve to his lips, a biological reaction I knew, in many species, to be a threat display. Yet his posture was relaxed, even amused. The second figure, a female, had a similar expression, but with an arch to her eyebrow that sent an instinctive shudder through my thorax. She looked curious. The third was the smallest, perhaps a juvenile. He looked barely old enough to be a university student. His movements were twitchy, restless, and his gaze flicked around the room, taking everything in as though this was some sort of game to him. They did not belong here, because they did not exist. And yet, the air itself seemed to tighten around me. I could feel the weight of every single student's gaze locked onto me, waiting for my reaction. Some were frozen in shock, others muttering in hushed whispers. A few of the more nervous species had already begun shifting their body temperatures in preparation for either fight or flight. I had to salvage this. I forced my stiff joints to move, gripping the podium as though it were the only solid object in the universe. My voice, when it finally emerged, was tighter than I intended. Greetings, Professor." The words came from the tallest human, spoken perfectly. Not a garbled, mistranslated mess, not the awkward cadence of an off-worlder struggling with our common tongue. Perfectly. The breath hitched in my throat. They shouldn't be able to speak our language like that. It took decades of exposure for even the most linguistically adept species to master Vecren standard. But this creature, this thing, had done so effortlessly. No, I reminded myself, it had to be a trick. A holographic disguise, a sophisticated translation filter, some kind of elaborate deception orchestrated by pranksters or misguided researchers eager to humiliate me. And yet, no projection, no AI simulation, no genetically altered mimic could replicate movement so precisely. The way they shifted their weight, the subtle flicks of their fingers, the controlled ease with which they stepped forward, every part of it screamed authenticity. The young one smirked and gave a small wave. "Hey, we heard you were teaching a class about us." A few students gasped. The female alien sitting in the front row clutched her translator module, her gills pulsing in agitation. "Thought we'd drop by," the human added. I nearly collapsed on the spot. I gripped the podium with both hands, my claws digging into the reinforced wood as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, the hum of the ventilation system suddenly too loud in my ears. My students sat in frozen disbelief, their various eye stalks, sensory tendrils, and multifaceted pupils all locked onto the impossible being standing at the entrance of my lecture hall. I had spent my entire career debunking this exact scenario. The absurdity, the sheer audacity of it nearly made me laugh. If I weren't actively having a biological crisis. The humans took another step forward. I could hear whispers rippling through the crowd. The Kvalan trio in the back row were clicking their mandibles together, a clear sign of distress. One of my Javaran students had begun frantically recording data into their neural drive, as though documenting the moment might somehow make it more comprehensible. Even the normally unflappable Ostari, known for their logical detachment, were showing signs of unease. Several had gone completely motionless, a classic prey animal response to overwhelming stimuli. The youngest human, the one who had spoken so casually, looked entirely unfazed. If anything, he seemed amused. I swallowed hard, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. This must be some kind of elaborate deception, I said, forcing my voice into the steady, authoritative cadence I had perfected over centuries of academic lectures. An experiment, perhaps. A well-crafted hoax. The tall male tilted his head. Why would we go through all that trouble? A perfectly reasonable question, and I had no reasonable answer. A trick, a deepfake, a hyper-advanced simulation. There had to be a rational explanation. "You claim to be human," I said carefully, willing my analytical mind to assert itself over the rising terror in my gut. "Do you have any evidence to support such an extraordinary claim?" The female smirked. "I mean, us standing right here seems like decent evidence." Several students audibly gasped. The sheer arrogance of it, the absolute confidence. Beings that had no right to exist were speaking to me as though I were the one who needed to justify myself. I felt my mandibles twitch. Existence is not a matter of mere assertion. Anyone can claim to be a mythological creature. That does not make it true. The young one grinned. Fair. I could claim to be a dragon. Would that make me one? There were actual records of dragons. But I refused to be baited. This university is built upon the foundation of rigorous scientific inquiry, I declared. For centuries, no credible evidence has ever been found to support the existence of humans. The tall male folded his arms. Sounds like you just didn't look hard enough. My exoskeleton tingled with rage. This was going to be the worst day of my life. I straightened my posture, forcing my mandibles to stop trembling. I was Professor Zilthor Goranik, foremost xenoanthropologist of the Vekran cluster, a scholar whose work had shaped modern academia's understanding of pre-contact civilizations. I had stood before the Grand Scientific Council and defended entire theses against hostile review boards. I had been quoted in thousands of scholarly papers. I would not be undone by 3 smug imposters parading as a myth. You claim to be human, I repeated, my voice finally steadying into something resembling authority, and yet you expect me to accept that claim without proper evidence? The tallest human, the one who seemed to think himself their leader, shrugged. We expected you'd be skeptical. Honestly, we figured we'd have a chat before you started teaching an entire room of students that we don't exist. The sheer audacity of the statement nearly made my spiracles close in indignation. You misunderstand the nature of academia, I snapped. It is not my responsibility to prove that humans do not exist. The burden of proof is on you, and, thus far, you have provided nothing that cannot be dismissed as deception, misidentification, or an elaborate prank. The young one, a student if I had to guess, grinned. We brought a book. A book? I scoffed, but the sound came out more uncertain than I liked. A book proves nothing. I could publish a book tomorrow claiming I was the lost emperor of Zenthor Prime. Would that make it true? The female human stepped forward and placed the object onto the nearest desk with a casual thud. The sound was solid, not the artificial chime of a projected illusion. My gaze snapped to the cover. It was printed. Not a data slate, not a holotext, a physical book. I hesitated, my hand hovering over it. Something about the weight of it, the stubborn presence of an object that should not exist, sent a shiver through my carapace. Slowly, I picked it up. The texture was strange. My fingertips felt the slight grain of natural fiber, an archaic material abandoned by most civilizations eons ago. The title read, The History of the Terran Diaspora. I flipped through the pages, skimming past the first lines of text, past the foreword, past the table of contents. Hundreds of pages of recorded history, scientific studies, cultural anthropology, the work of lifetimes. This was not fabricated overnight. A low, involuntary click rattled in the back of my throat. My mind screamed at me to dismiss it, to find the flaw, the forgery, the inconsistencies that would bring this entire absurd claim crashing down. I found none. I looked up slowly, gripping the book like a lifeline. My voice was a whisper. Where have you been? The humans exchanged glances. The female smirked. Around, the tall one said. The young one grinned wider. We like to let civilizations figure things out for themselves first. My entire worldview shattered. My spiracles fluttered erratically as I struggled to draw in a full breath. My entire career, my entire understanding of galactic history, was unraveling before my very eyes, and these creatures, these humans, stood before me with the same casual indifference one might expect from a student handing in a late assignment. I gripped the book tighter, as if the weight of it might somehow ground me in reality. It had to be a trick. It had to be an elaborate fabrication, a hoax so deeply intricate that it would take decades to unravel. And yet, the pages felt real, the ink smelled real, the certainty in the human's expressions was infuriatingly, agonizingly real. "Explain," I demanded, though my voice lacked the firm authority I had intended. The tallest human, the one who unsettled me the most, tilted his head. "What exactly do you want to know?" I resisted the urge to hiss in frustration. "Everything," I snapped. "Humans are a myth, a fabrication, an academic curiosity, nothing more. You cannot simply—" I gestured at them wildly, my exoskeleton clicking from the force of my movements. "Appear and expect me to accept that centuries of research have been fundamentally, catastrophically wrong." The young one laughed. I felt my internal temperature spike in sheer indignation. "Look," he said, grinning, "we're not saying all of your research is wrong, just the part where you think we never existed." I stared at him, stunned into silence. The female human leaned against a desk, crossing her arms. "Professor, think about it logically. You know that every major civilization has some version of human mythology, right?" I nodded stiffly. That much was true. Stories of humans were universal across galactic cultures, always lingering on the edges of ancient history, never fully confirmed, but never quite forgotten. "And yet," she continued, "no one can ever agree on where we were, when we disappeared, or why." "Because you never existed," I shot back. She raised an eyebrow. "Or because we made sure no one could." My spiracles snapped shut, my hands clenched around the book. "You're suggesting that humans chose to erase themselves from galactic history?" The tallest one exhaled sharply. "More like we were really good at keeping secrets. And by the time people started noticing we were gone, it was easier to let the myth take over." I felt my exoskeleton vibrate with the sheer wrongness of what I was hearing. "That is absurd. Entire species cannot simply vanish." "Of course we can," the young one said, smirking. "We just had to want it badly enough." The room was utterly silent. I had spent my life disproving ghost stories, and now I was speaking to one. The silence in the lecture hall was absolute. My students, once the brightest minds of their respective civilizations, each eager to dissect the so-called myth of humanity, now sat in rigid, breathless stillness. The Kavalan scholars had folded their multi-lobed hands together, their crests pulsing faintly in distress. The Javaran nobles, whose crystalline neural structures could process information at impossible speeds, had gone eerily motionless, as though even they could not compute what they were witnessing. I, however, could not afford stillness. My mind burned with too many thoughts, too many implications, all clashing in a battle of logic versus undeniable, terrifying reality. "They let the myth take over," the human had said. A chill settled deep within my thorax. "You are telling me," I began, voice low and tight, "that humans, a species capable of interstellar travel, a species that, by all accounts, possessed significant technological and biological adaptability, simply chose to disappear from galactic history?" The youngest human shrugged. "Well, not all at once. Took a few centuries." A few centuries. As if that were a reasonable timeline for an entire species to orchestrate its own erasure. The female human leaned forward slightly. "Professor, think about it. What happens to a civilization when it becomes too influential, too powerful?" My mandibles tightened. "It attracts enemies." She nodded. "Exactly." "And what happens to the civilizations that attract too many enemies?" I exhaled sharply. "They are wiped out." "Or," the tall one interjected smoothly, "they learn how to stop being a target." A deep, unsettling dread coiled inside me. You're implying that humanity went into hiding on purpose, that you engineered your own disappearance to avoid conflict. Not just conflict, the young one said, grinning in a way that made my exoskeleton itch. To avoid extinction. I opened my mouth to refute him, to tell him that such a thing was impossible, that a species could not simply erase itself from the records of an entire galaxy. But I stopped. Because what if it wasn't impossible? I had spent years cataloging lost civilizations, their ruins scattered across forgotten planets, their histories reduced to speculation. Some had fallen to war, some to disease, others to natural disasters. But what if some had simply left? I felt a tremor in my claws. This was wrong. The universe itself felt wrong. And now, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, you've returned. The female human smiled. It was an expression unlike anything I had ever seen. Amused, calculating, and completely unbothered by the seismic shift she had just caused in academic thought. Or like we never really left, she said. We just stopped answering the door. A cold realization slammed into me. How many of you are out there? The young one grinned wider. Wouldn't you like to know? The weight of their words pressed against my exoskeleton like an unseen force, heavy and unrelenting. My mind, trained over decades to dismantle falsehoods and seek logic in the chaotic tapestry of history, fought against the absurdity of the situation. And yet, there was no denying it. The evidence was right in front of me, speaking to me, laughing at me. The youngest human, so confident, so maddeningly smug, tilted his head, clearly enjoying the turmoil unraveling inside me. You're taking this pretty well, Professor. I barely heard him. My gaze dropped to the book still clutched in my trembling hands. My fingers traced the spine, the rough edges of the printed pages, a technology so antiquated it predated most of the civilizations represented in this lecture hall. This changes everything, I whispered, more to myself than to them. The tall one shrugged. Not really. Your history stays the same. You just get to correct one tiny little detail. Tiny? My voice cracked. Tiny? This is the single greatest historical revelation in recorded memory. This is the unraveling of centuries of academic certainty. The female human smirked. You're welcome. The audacity of these creatures, the sheer infuriating casualness with which they spoke. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted proof. Dates, locations, and explanation for how an entire species had eluded galactic scrutiny for so long. I wanted to interrogate them, dissect their claims until I found the flaw that would return my universe to normal. But something deep inside me knew there was no flaw, and that terrified me more than anything. A rustling sound pulled me back into the moment. My students, brilliant, ambitious, once so certain in their understanding of the universe, sat frozen, their gazes darting between me and the humans with expressions that ranged from abject terror to fascination. Some of them were recording. The thought horrified me. If this got out, if this lecture became the moment the galaxy learned the truth, entire institutions would crumble. Centuries of scholarship would be invalidated overnight. Governments, military forces, scientific communities, all of them would descend upon this revelation like starving beasts. And humans knew it. I swallowed hard. Why now? The young one grinned. Why not? A sharp chime rang through the hall. My internal clock registered it. The lecture period had ended. For the first time in my entire career, I had completely lost control of my own class. The students hesitated, uncertain, waiting for guidance, waiting for me to tell them what to believe. The humans exchanged glances. We should get going, the female said. The tall one nodded. Yeah, we've definitely overstayed our welcome. I took a step forward, panic clawing at my chest. Wait! They turned back. I stared at them, my thoughts a chaotic mess of fear, anger, curiosity. What do I do with this? I asked, voice almost pleading. The young one grinned one last time. Write a paper, Professor.